Spotlight, Spotlight with Jerome. Sit down, the show's starting.
Hello everybody, welcome back to Spotlight with Jerome. I had the pleasure to chat with the brilliant Steve Smith. So if you don't know who Steve Smith is, where have you been, people? He's a very influential language teaching and learning blogger, presenter, trainer, language teacher with over 30 years experience, the author of Becoming an Outstanding Languages Teacher, 50 Lessons Plans for French Teacher, and co-author of 3 books with Gianfranco Conti, The Language Teacher Toolkit, Breaking the Sound Barrier, and Memory, What Every Language Teacher Should Know. So hope you enjoy it.
I've got very clear memories of beginning to learn French when I was aged 11 at secondary school. And in those days, we were using Voix et Images de France, where we had audiolingual slides and sentences to repeat with beeps and so on. And I just loved the sound of the language, and I was quite good at repeating. I had a very good ear, as they say, and I sort of fell in love with it straight away. And then went to France on a school visit about a year later, and then later did an exchange and fell in love with French culture. And now I spend quite a bit of my time in France as well. So I think originally it was probably to do with abilities that I had to mimic and just enjoy the sounds of a different language. Okay, so I'd done my first degree in French and linguistics. I was a bit more interested in the language side than the literature side. And I think I had an interest in language acquisition and classroom teaching techniques right from back in my school days. I'd observed my own teachers and what they were doing, and I was trying to get inside their head, and I could begin to see why they were doing what they were doing. In particular, I had a teacher called Colin Ringe, who retired from teaching and went on to teacher training, and he was very much into reading and listening. And although he never would have said this, I had a strong sense that he was using the idea of input, comprehensible input, to teach. So it was quite progressive for those days. And so I always had this interest in applied linguistics and second language acquisition. And then I'd been teaching for about 5 or 6 years and had the opportunity to do a part-time MA at the University of London. So that involved going up to the Institute of Education once a week for seminars. And then the big thing was to do a major dissertation. Interested me, which was the difference between conscious learning and unconscious learning. And at that time, I'm talking about 1985, Stephen Krashen was really quite influential. And so I related my dissertation to the whole history of conscious and unconscious learning, and then to Krashen's new reiteration of it, which he called learning and acquisition. And the argument still goes on. It's kind of been renamed explicit and implicit learning, but it's the same sort of thing that Krashen was talking about and that people have been talking about actually for centuries. And one interesting thing here is that when Gianfranco and I hooked up in about 2016, I'd been reading his blogs and he'd been reading blogs. And I think it was a third person who said, why don't you two get together and start to write something? And because we were both, we're quite fast workers. And I think it's probably fair to say we're quite impatient workers. We want things done quickly. And so when we were talking about putting a book together, which became the Language Teacher Toolkit, we had a choice to make. Should we write it and look for a publisher, or should we self-publish, independently publish? And we ummed and ahed about this, but decided in the end, because we both had enough presence on social media already, I think, that it would be more profitable for us, to be frank, to self-publish, but also we didn't really need the help of a publisher at that point. So the 3 books we've written together have all been independently published and been very successful. So I think for anyone who wants to share their knowledge about language teaching, it is a possible route to go down. But you just have to make sure that when you do something like that, it's of high quality, that it's very thoroughly proofed and thoroughly edited, so that what you
had
get
a
is something
super
You had a super editor. Your wife is fabulous also. Did she do the editing on all the books, didn't she?
Yes, she did. And her background is herself as an editor, but she's in a different field, the field of international education at university level. But she has her own book series and has been editing for quite some years. And because she also has a background as a language teacher originally, she was able to kind of easily interpret the sort of things that Gianfranco and I were writing. So that's been a big plus. She also helped me with my 50 lesson plans book. And it was a piece of advice I was given by another writer who said that whatever you do, you must get an editor. And I think anyone who wants to share their knowledge, and there are lots of language teachers who can do this, then if you do it in book form, just get at least one good editor, and that will help you enormously. I mean, when I was originally trained, I think I was well trained at PGCE, and at that time, one of the dominant methodologies was the so-called oral approach, the British oral approach, which had originally gone back to the beginnings of the 20th century, a kind of direct method, target language teaching, but where the curriculum was still grammar-based, and the teaching was largely teacher-led through question and answer. So it had elements of the communicative approach in it. It was strongly target language, but still essentially based on building up grammatical skill, but orally through lots of listening, lots of speaking, and then supported by reading and writing. So I was trained in that, but even then I was aware of the limitations of that sort of approach and that it wasn't actually terribly communicative. And quite quickly, I learned something really about what the communicative approach is and what genuine communication is. And I always had then this tension between to what extent could I bring that into the classroom and balance it against the needs of an O-level, as it was originally, and then a GCSE syllabus, which has certain demands. So I think what happened over the years was I started off as quite a progressive communicative teacher, probably over the years became somewhat more conservative and built in a greater amount of grammar, a greater amount of vocabulary learning, and slightly more formal methods. But there are no best methods, I always say. And I think you have to work with the classes you've got in the schools you've got, and based on your own beliefs about language teaching. And I think if you try and apply a methodology which you're not comfortable with, it's unlikely to work. So in a sense, I once did a talk about this at Research Ed in Oxford. And my message was, it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it. And that whatever methodology you use, it's the quality of the delivery that will make it work. So if you use a more audiolingual approach, you can make that work. If you use a strongly communicative task-based approach, you can make it work. If you like EPI, Conti approach, you can make that work. But you can always adapt it to your own preferences, so long as you keep the basic principles there. And to me, those basic principles remain comprehensible input, interaction, communication, and repetition, I would say I would add in there as well. I think they're the sort of thoughts I've had over the years about language teaching. Busy and I'm not busy. I mean, I'm semi-retired, so I do a lot of traveling with my wife, and I relax, I do exercise, and I play the drums a bit, I sing in a choir. So I do lots of other stuff. But I do the amount of work that it pleases me to do. And the reason I do it is that I just cannot stop thinking about the process of language teaching. And I never realized to what extent it would stay part of me. And whenever I train teachers, one of the things I often tell them is that I can't stop dreaming about language teaching. And I don't think this happened when I was in the classroom, but since I've left the classroom, I seem to be reliving all these experiences in retirement. So essentially, I can't stop thinking about it, and I'm constantly fascinated by ideas, and therefore I enjoy sharing ideas, both my own ideas and the ideas of other people. And I think probably I still have the mentality of a teacher, except now I'm not teaching pupils. I hope I'm teaching and helping other teachers and teacher trainees. So that gives me a lot of pleasure. If I go into a school or if I work with PGCE students, for example, that gives me a buzz. I really enjoy doing that, particularly when it's live, face to face. I've been, like many teachers, producing lots of worksheets for my lessons. And I bought myself a very small book from W.H. Smith's called How to Build a Simple Website, which I did. And I started to upload some of my worksheets onto this simple website, which I think I called originally Mr. Smith French Teacher, something like that. And then it gradually built up and it became my own go-to archive or repository of resources for the classroom. And my colleagues at Ripon would use it as well. And then when I knew I was coming up to retirement from the classroom, I thought, well, I still want to keep writing. I want to keep doing these resources, but it would be crazy if I did it for nothing. So I thought we could have a low price subscription model for the website, which is what we did. And I was helped in the process by a former pupil of mine, actually, Harry Green, and he was very keen on ICT. He was studying at A-level, and for a project, he said he could launch the site for me and set up the membership system using WordPress. So he did that, and he still keeps an eye on it from a distance, although he's now working for an IT company in New Zealand. And if I ever have a problem with the website, which doesn't happen often, but if I do, then I can call on him to help and do updates and so on. So it started like that. I never knew how successful it would be. So I think at the moment, I've got something like 1,200 schools and tutors who subscribe. I think I've peaked out about 1,500 roughly, but it varies. Some schools just come back year after year.
That's
Others
impressive.
will, yeah, other people will dip in for a year, download all the resources they want, and then leave it, which is fine. Others, schools will come back 4, 5, 6, 7 years and just keep coming back every year. That motivates me to keep adding new stuff to the site. So if I don't keep it fresh, then people won't come back. Most days I like to write something for the site, which I enjoy doing. I enjoy being productive in that way. The idea for that was, as you know, both Gianfranco and I have tried to write stuff that links research to classroom practice. And we're both very aware, and I'm particularly aware, that most teachers haven't got the time or particularly the inclination to go and read original research. And often original research has no direct application to the classroom anyway. So when we wrote the Language Teacher Toolkit, Breaking the Sound Barrier, the Memory Book, they are all very strongly research informed, but with a strong emphasis on what happens in the classroom. So that was my thinking with Informed Language Teacher. I just thought, well, most teachers can't access research. Could I simply curate a website with articles, videos, and podcasts, which are all freely available, so that you don't have to have a subscription to an academic journal because they're ridiculously expensive. But fortunately, there's quite a lot of stuff out there which you can read freely or even watch freely. So I'm always on the lookout for articles. So I find them interesting myself. I curate them to the extent that I think they've got to be readable enough and useful enough for teachers. So I just uploaded one this morning, actually. It was a paper shared by Liam Printer, who I'm sure some listeners will know, and he's very interested in motivation and self-determination theory, and he just had a paper published in an open access journal, and I thought this is a great one to share with other teachers, so that's gone on to the motivation page of my site. But that's the kind of background to Informed Language Teacher. So there's no charge for that, clearly. It's just kind of my little favor to the language teaching community. I tweet a lot. I started off as a Twitter skeptic, but actually I tweet loads. And Twitter is great for reaching out to lots of people, but it is somewhat scattergun. It's not very focused. And therefore, when you follow people, you're not quite sure what you're going to get. And ideally, I'd like to follow people who talk about languages and language teaching. But most people tweet about different things. So that's why I say it's a little bit scattergun, because you have to carefully run through and find what interests you. So if anyone is developing their use of Twitter, I would say be very careful who you follow, and maybe have a certain discipline about what you tweet. So for example, I don't say I do this 100% of the time, but nearly all the time I tweet about language teaching. I try generally to avoid politics and other matters, because I want people to know that my, quote, brand is as a language teacher. I'd say the best places to interact socially, and where I do, would be on Facebook. That's where the action is now. That's where you find lots of other supportive teachers. lots of practical ideas, groups that are very well moderated, such as the Guilt group, which I can recommend. Other groups like Secondary MFL Matters, A-level French teaching group. I mean, there are loads and loads of them, some of them with very, very specific goals in mind, including individual works of literature or films that people study at A-level. So Facebook and Twitter are my two things. I haven't touched Instagram because I think I spend enough time on social media. Well, we didn't meet physically until, let me think, I think it was probably 2017 when we got together at the Research Ed event for MFL and English in Oxford. And that's the first time we'd actually met, when Gianfranco flew in for a quick weekend in Oxford. So that was good fun. We've met personally a few times since, when he's in England doing his tours, his speaking tours. But apart from that, we work online, we tweet to each other, we send each other emails. And when we write, it's interesting, our process. So the first book, The Language Teacher Toolkit, was more my baby, but I used a lot of Gianfranco's material, and then we would swap chapters, swap drafts, make comments on each other's drafts, and eventually end up with the final book. The Breaking the Sound Barrier book was primarily Gianfranco as the lead writer, and he was primarily responsible for certain chapters, and I took other chapters. And again, I was the one who kind of did the final write-up, but that was mostly Gianfranco's material, I would say. The memory book, I took the lead on, but Gianfranco had serious input into aspects of the book. I would say particularly the sections on cognitive load theory and specific teaching ideas. But again, we swap material, we check each other, make comments, suggest changes, additions, and so on, and eventually end up with a final product. And each book would take a number of months to put together. But the great thing about self-publishing is that once you've got your final PDF, essentially you've got your book as a PDF, you upload it to Amazon, or the Amazon branch called KDP, which is their self-publishing branch, and it's published within a day or two. So it's that fast. Whereas for my other book, Becoming an Outstanding Languages Teacher, which I've just done the second edition for, there's a whole process through the publisher that takes roughly, I would say, 6 months. So once you produce your final version, after all the proofing that goes on and the formatting, you're then looking at about 6 months before it finally comes to print. So in this case, I'd really written that book essentially by about November 2021, and it gets published in August of this year. Definitely. I don't know how soon, because we're both busy, in particular Gianfranco is very busy sharing information about EPI, curriculum planning, and so on. As you know, he spends a lot of time working on courses. But yeah, we've talked about the next book, and we've looked at it, different possibilities. Perhaps I don't want to share exactly what our thought is on that, but I would say that we do have an idea for the next book. And broadly speaking, it's going to be something like comprehension to fluency, and the journey from comprehension input through to developing fluency. And how that actually pans out as a precise book, we'll have to see. But we've had discussions about that, and I think we have a pretty good idea of where we want to go with it. Brilliant. But I'm not going to spoil it. The book has done quite well for Routledge, but I was aware that some things were dated. Now, in particular, all the boxes in the book, which are called tech tips, so this is advice for teachers on using digital technology, they were already getting dated, which I knew they would. It's the nature of the field. So I felt I had to rejig all of those sections, which is virtually every chapter where there's a box about tech tools. So that was one thing I wanted to do. Another thing I wanted to do was slightly upgrade the importance that I was putting on lexicogrammar, sentence builders, and so on. That was already in the book to a degree, but given its relative popularity now in schools, I thought that I should give that a little bit more attention. So that was the second thing. Was that in the first edition, there was very little attention paid to culture, intercultural understanding. And so I decided I wanted to incorporate a chapter on that. So there is a new chapter. And then apart from that, it was really a question of just tinkering with the text, making it more concise, which you can always do when you're writing. Changing some of the activity ideas, for example, starters, fillers, and plenaries, and also adjusting the final chapter, which is about case studies of different sorts of approaches. So I just had to check that material on the TPRS approach, teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling. So I had to double check that material to check it was up to date. And also the material I'd written about Michaela Community School in London and their knowledge organizer approach. So I went back to them. I mean, originally I visited that school to look at some lessons to do my research. And I'd spoken with Barry Smith and other teachers. But I was aware that things have moved on. That school has moved on and changed to some extent. And so I wanted to update that material. So I would say the new edition is fundamentally the same as the first in that the focus is on the nuts and bolts of lesson planning. It doesn't have research references. That's not the USP of this book. This is much more about teachers learning the trade and how to plan lessons and the sort of options they have available. And so that the chapters which are called dissecting lessons are about that. And there's a number of chapters which are about unpacking lesson planning, if you like. That stays the same, but I've had to change other aspects just to keep it up to date, I would say.
Fair enough. And yeah, brilliant. And obviously, you mentioned Joe Dell who's been very influential in your tech advice and things like that. Joe is an absolute mine of obviously of technology.
Yeah, well, the thing there is that, of course, I'm not in the classroom. I'm not doing that stuff. So in that sense, you could say I'm a bit of a fraud even writing about it. But I mean, this is always the case when you write books. You don't have expertise on everything, but you have to source the best expertise that you can get. And I found Joe's YouTube channel fantastic for that. All the interviews he does with different teachers. And I'd mention in particular the work of Esmeralda Salgado at the moment. She's writing some fabulous blogs. She's applying technology in very practical, usable ways. So I found her stuff useful and lots of other sources. And I went out onto social media and asked teachers, what are they using? What works for you? I know that 5 years down the line, some of that material will be out of date, but it just seemed important to me that in the book, there ought to be reference to digital tech, and you need to do it justice. You need to give plenty of examples of how it's used.
Absolutely, fair enough. Brilliant.
In our household, my wife takes the lead on cooking, and I'm like the commis chef. I do a lot of the chopping and the preparing and so on. But no, I do like to cook. We like to cook together. And we really enjoy Thai food, spicy Indian curries. We love French cheese. We have a real weakness for cheese. And so, I have to watch that. I have to watch that for my weight and so on. But,
yes, yeah.
I love things like Roquefort cheese, Saint-Agur, Comté, Gruyere. Well, love the cheese. But one of the things I often mention cooking when I'm training is in relation to working memory. So yes, we said this before, but when you're doing a recipe and you're reading the recipe from the page, aren't you? And then you're carrying out each piece of the recipe. You forget things straight away, don't you?
You
so
do,
you look
yes.
At the first, you look at the first couple of instructions, and then you go across to start, whatever you're doing, pressing your garlic or chopping your onions, and then you realize you've forgotten what the next bit is, and you have to keep going back to the recipe. And that's an analogy I like to use when it comes to the fragility of working memory, to go back to language learning, and that how we have to keep rehearsing things in memory all the time. And in the classroom, think of the poor pupil who's struggling with language, and they can't hold a sentence in their head very easily, and yet we think as teachers that they can. So we have to give them the opportunity to constantly rehearse, either silently or out loud. So that's one of the sort of messages that you get when you think about working memory and helping children.
Absolutely, yeah, totally.
We're about to go tomorrow. We're going down to Oxford to see my son and his partner, and then from there we're going down to France. And our house is near La Rochelle, just inland from La Rochelle in the Charente-Maritime. We spend the whole summer there, and then we try and go there at other times during the year as well. So on average, we probably spend at least 3 or 4 months over there, and we love it. We absolutely love that part of France. And if anyone knows La Rochelle and the islands off the coast there, you know how beautiful it is. So that's our French connection. And the reason we go there is that originally my school did a French exchange with another school just a bit further south near Saintes, but we made friends in that general area. And so that was one of the reasons that we wanted to keep contact with our French friends there. So yeah, we love going there. It's a real magnet for us. Say I play the drums. I have an electronic drum kit, and I like to play along with music that I enjoy.
Do you play in a band also, and the drums?
I used to play in a pub band, but I haven't played like that for about 6 or 7 years at least. But I have done that. But now I listen to progressive rock music, and I play along badly. I do sing. I read. I tend to read detective novels. I try to go jogging or do exercise each day, which is important to try and stay fit. And I enjoy traveling. My wife and I just came back from America. We had a great time touring the far west, Yellowstone and Wyoming, which was a real eye-opener for us. So I love travel as well.
Fantastic.